We are now in a world where, according to our president, Canadian steel is a national security threat to the United States. And Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is a bad guy. But brutal North Korean dictator Kim Jong un is funny, smart, a great negotiator, has a great personality, and is loved by the North Korean people. That's according to President Donald Trump. Interestingly, two polls, both done by Ipsos, one for Global News in Canada and one for Reuters in the United States, both of these new polls show that it's not just Canadians, but also Americans that are more likely to agree with Justin Trudeau on this issue of Canada versus US trade than with Donald Trump. 72% of Canadians, and I guess somewhat surprisingly, but in a sense not that surprisingly, 57% of Americans approve of how Canada and Justin Trudeau are handling the trade dispute over the number who support Donald Trump as the guy who's handling it well. Check out these results. Four questions were asked. First of all, do you approve of how Trudeau is handling the situation? 57% of Americans agree. 72% of Canadians agree. Question number two, the situation has damaged relations between the US and Canada. Almost everybody agrees on that. 71% of Americans and 81% of Canadians. Third question was Canada shouldn't overreact, or statement. Canada shouldn't overreact to President Trump's recent comments. It was just political posturing related to the NAFTA negotiations. Again, between 52 and 57% between Americans and Canadians agree with that, which basically means half of both Americans and Canadians, to a degree, think that this is just a stunt from Donald Trump. And lastly, I approve of how President Donald Trump is handling the situation. Only 14% of Canadians agree with that, but interestingly, only 37% of Americans even agree with that. What horrible anti-American Americans, right? Or maybe they just understand that this is a trade war that, like many, is one you can't win. You have to pick your battles with whoever it is that you're working with geopolitically, and that maybe picking battles with allies and praising brutal dictators is bad politics. And when you take sort of a step back from it, it's not really that surprising, right? I mean, just we've had this hyper normalization, which, as I've spoken about, has kind of desensitized us to a lot of the absurdity that we're seeing. But it doesn't mean that some basic truths don't remain self-evident, right? For example, Canada is a longtime ally of the United States, and Russia, as of late, is not. North Korea, as of late, for many, many decades, is not. And that doesn't mean that I, as a progressive, am being unfairly hostile or want to be unfairly punitive to Russia or North Korea. This has become very popular among, again, it's this sort of Leninist, Hugo Chavez loving, Bashar al-Assad defending, Putin defending strain of the left. That strain of the left is attacking other progressives and saying, you guys are hypocrites. You claim that you don't want war, yet you sound like you're pushing for war with North Korea or with Russia or with Syria or whoever. That's not what we're doing. What I'm pointing out is that we have to realize that, hey, wait a second, we're not alone on this planet. Canada has been an ally. North Korea and Russia have not. And thus it's perfectly rational and reasonable, to the extent that anybody in the White House is a rational actor, to deal with Canada as an ally and not to deal with Kim Jong un as this brilliant and incredibly humorous guy with an amazing personality who can be trusted. So that's the point that I'm making. And I actually read online in some bottom dwelling right wing forum a comment that was something like, I'm glad Trump is finally sticking it to Canada. And I thought, sticking it to Canada for what, right? Providing steel for our tanks? What exactly are we trying to stick it to Canada for? And as usual, the theme is one that continues to be persistent in the Trump White House, which is that Trump is very sort of impressed with and taken by authoritarian leaders and very eager to negotiate with them. And Canada is not an authoritarian country. It's a quiet, liberal democracy. Justin Trudeau, not a megalomaniac authoritarian, but a bilingual, educated French Canadian, it's just not really appealing to Trump, right? Nothing about that impresses Trump. And in the end, when it comes to the specifics of the tariffs, remember that Donald Trump has identified what he's calling unfair tariffs from Canada. A lot of those are retaliatory tariffs that exist only because of either American tariffs or American subsidies. Dairy is one example, right? The United States dairy industry receives massive subsidies. Without a Canadian tariff, because we have trade on dairy between the US and Canada, if Canada didn't react to the massive American subsidy on dairy with the tariff that they have, Canada's dairy industry would be destroyed because, shocker, you don't actually have dairy operating in a free market because of those massive U.S. subsidies on the dairy industry. So it's all backwards, and I unfortunately see no way of getting out of this bizarre sort of circular hell that we're in, other than voting in November and voting again in 2010. And I'm going to actually talk specifically about voting a little bit later on in today's program.